A young teenage girl, only 13, screamed in terror on a blood-soaked bed. A midwife, her hands shaking and covered in blood, fought desperately to save both the girl and her baby. The girl's tiny body was breaking apart, too small, too young, never meant for this nightmare. The baby was trapped, and death hung over the room like a shadow. This horror unfolded at a castle in the bitter winter of 1457. Everyone watching knew a monstrous crime had been committed. Margaret Beaufort should never have been pregnant. What you're about to discover is the brutal truth behind England's greatest dynasty, a story historians have hidden for centuries. This isn't just about a child forced to marry a predator twice her age. This is about how the most powerful people in England watched it happen and did nothing. It's about how that broken, traumatized girl clawed her way to become the most feared woman in Tudor England. This shocking story comes from secret records, medical documents, and even the dying confession of Margaret's own priest. Margaret's nightmare wasn't unique. Even in medieval times, people knew this was evil, yet they let it happen anyway because money mattered more than a child's life. Margaret entered the world in 1443 at a magnificent castle, born into unimaginable wealth and power. Her father ruled as the Duke of Somerset, one of England's most dangerous men. But before Margaret could even walk, disaster struck. Her father died under mysterious circumstances that whispered of suicide and scandal. In medieval England, suicide wasn't just tragic, it was a family-destroying curse that turned you into prey overnight. Suddenly, baby Margaret transformed from a protected princess into the richest, most vulnerable target in the kingdom. She owned more castles, land, and gold than most adults would see in 10 lifetimes. To powerful men, she wasn't a child. She was a walking treasure chest that needed to be captured. The vultures circled before she could even speak. When Margaret was barely 3 years old, King Henry VI made his first move, handing her over like property to the Duke of Suffolk. The Duke's response was swift and sickening. He immediately forced this toddler to marry his 7-year-old son. A 3-year-old bride who probably couldn't even say her own vows. They needed the Pope's blessing because the children were related. The Pope said yes, making the Church itself part of this grotesque trade in human flesh. Suffolk's plan exploded when he was brutally murdered in 1453, his political empire crashing down. Suddenly, little Margaret was back on the auction block, and King Henry VI was ready to make the decision that would destroy her life forever. He gave her to Edmund Tudor, a man with ice in his veins and greed in his heart. Edmund was 24 years old, a grown man hungry for power. Margaret was 12, still playing with toys. They were married in November 1455, but what happened next reveals the true evil of medieval politics. Most medieval men, however brutal, followed one unspoken law: you didn't touch your child bride until she was at least 14 years old. This wasn't kindness, it was pure survival. They'd watched too many young girls die screaming in childbirth to ignore the danger. Edmund Tudor had different plans. Within days of their wedding, possibly on their wedding night itself, he sexually assaulted Margaret. Medieval law had a deadly loophole that Edmund exploited: if a rich wife died without children, her fortune returned to her birth family. But if she died after giving birth, her husband inherited everything for life. Edmund made a calculation that would haunt history: get her pregnant immediately, secure the massive fortune, even if the pregnancy killed her. Her life was just the price of doing business. By April 1456, Margaret was pregnant and terrified. Then her nightmare deepened. Edmund was captured in one of England's endless wars and died rotting in a prison cell. Margaret found herself alone, 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, in a country tearing itself apart. But here's where Margaret's incredible steel first showed itself. Despite carrying a child, despite winter storms, despite armies roaming the countryside, she made an impossible journey through war-torn England to reach Pembroke Castle and the protection of Jasper Tudor, her dead husband's brother. The journey alone could have killed her. But Margaret was learning that survival meant taking deadly risks. January 28, 1457. The day that would decide the fate of English royalty. Margaret's labor began, and immediately everyone knew they were witnessing horror. Margaret was tiny even for her age, her hips narrow, her body still that of a child. The baby was coming, but her underdeveloped frame couldn't handle it. Hour after agonizing hour passed. Experienced midwives who had delivered hundreds of babies stared in shock. This wasn't normal childbirth, This was a child's body being destroyed from the inside. The trauma was so devastating that Margaret's reproductive system shut down permanently. She would never have another child despite marrying twice more. In an era when women routinely bore 10 or 15 children, Margaret Beaufort had exactly one. Against all odds, both mother and baby survived. They named the boy Henry, the future Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for over a century. Every Tudor monarch who followed traced their bloodline back to that night of horror: Henry VIII and his 6 wives, Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I the Virgin Queen. They all owed their existence to Margaret's suffering. All that power, all that glory, all those famous names started with a child being assaulted for her inheritance. The Tudors didn't conquer their way to power through noble battles. They rose because a 12-year-old was raped for money, and somehow both she and her baby survived. Margaret rose from that trauma to become one of the most powerful people in England. She helped orchestrate her son's rise to the throne, founded colleges that still exist today, and signed her name Margaret R. as if she were royalty herself. But the scars ran deeper than her body. Decades later, when her own granddaughter faced an arranged marriage to the young King of Scotland, Margaret fought desperately to stop it. Her son recorded her frantic words: "The Queen and my mother are very much against this marriage. They fear the King of Scots would not wait but injure her and endanger her health." Margaret understood exactly what "not waiting" meant. She had lived through the consequences. But even her power wasn't enough. Her granddaughter was sent to Scotland anyway, married at 13, just like Margaret had been. History repeated itself, and Margaret had to watch helplessly as another child faced her fate. Modern historians love to make excuses for what happened to Margaret. They talk about different times and medieval customs, trying to normalize the abuse. Here's the truth they're hiding: what Edmund Tudor did was shocking even by medieval standards. Most noble families wrote contracts specifically forbidding consummation until the bride was older. The typical minimum age was 14, often much later. What happened to Margaret wasn't normal medieval practice, it was recognized abuse that powerful people allowed because greed trumped a child's welfare. Every time you see Henry VIII's portrait or watch a movie about Elizabeth I, remember the foundation their dynasty was built on. Behind every crown and castle lies suffering that the powerful chose to ignore. When Margaret died in 1509, she had outlived 4 husbands and seen her family rule England. She had accumulated vast wealth and left an educational legacy through her college foundations. But her body never healed from what Edmund Tudor did to her. She spent decades trying to protect other girls from her fate, and failing. Margaret's story isn't ancient history, it's a warning that echoes today. In a world where child marriage still exists, where young girls are still sold like property, Margaret Beaufort stands as proof of what happens when adults fail to protect children. She survived the unsurvivable and even shaped history. But the cost was everything: her childhood, her body, her chance at more children, her ability to save her granddaughter. The Tudor rose didn't bloom in royal gardens. It grew from bloodied soil, watered with the tears of a child who deserved protection and got exploitation instead. Margaret Beaufort was 12 when a grown man decided her life was worth less than her money. She was 13 when she nearly died giving birth to England's future king. She was a survivor who spent her remaining years fighting battles she couldn't win. Behind the glory of history lies this truth: dynasties are built on the bodies of the powerless. Margaret paid that price so we could learn from it. Maybe by remembering her real story, not the sanitized version, we can honor her memory and fight for the children who still need protecting today.